Alright, so today I will be doing my major writing assignment 3, and I'll pretty much be going over and reviewing every single assignment that I have done throughout the whole course. And first I'm going to start with is the notes that we took at the beginning of the semester, and it is media literacy. It says here, media literacy is important because it provides a variety of different skills across a lifetime. A media literate person is someone who can access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act in, which is key to media literacy. Understanding media is important considering that it is all over the place. Examples would be like Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, Twitter, all forms of media. And then from the video that I had watched, it asks us, to explain what, media literacy is in 3 minutes. Media literacy doesn't just play a part in social media, it plays a part in images, words, sounds, examples like newspaper, posters, TV, and billboards. They all play a part as well. And then why does it matter? To avoid misinformation. There are a lot of fake news informations on social media, which is like a fallacy. And that's actually one of the other concepts that we did in class that I'm gonna go over in this video. It's in one of our Mbongis, fallacies. And then on social media, you have to critically think and pay close attention to what you see and hear and see, because it can affect your judgment on people and your daily life. And then I got key information, always verify information and cross-check sources. So pretty much like if you are citing a source or you're citing a source from an author, you always want to just check, just make sure that you're getting it from the right source, you're getting it from the right website, getting it from the right information. You just want to make sure everything's correct. And then over here, this is the rest of the first page. Explain the difference between disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. These are 3 different types of content. These are 3 groups that are known as information disorder. It's always good to ask yourself how that information came to exist. And then we have a diagram about the speaker, writing, context, logos, ethos, pathos. I'm gonna go more into that for my Mbongi that I'm going to show right after this. But this is pretty much just a diagram explaining it. And then in the middle says purpose, chaos, as his message and thesis. And then to the back, we have persuasive techniques. These are always good. Persuasive techniques are always good because writers tend to use these. Sometimes if you're writing an essay, if you want to get the audience to be more and more, not just interested in what you're saying or what you're writing about, but you could communicate their feelings, or you can use logic. There more that goes into ethos, pathos, and logos. But here we have keyword rhetoric, often used in our daily lives and in daily communication. Ethos definitely plays a role in how persuasion is made, especially credibility. For instance, let's say a person is being integrated for a robbery and he says he's innocent, but the detective has proof that he's not. He has a paper that the criminal written with his plans on the robbery that he did. Therefore, that would count as evidence, and that would be an example of credibility and ethos, because the detective, my fault, I didn't mean to say he doesn't have evidence. He does have evidence. And therefore, that would be an example of credibility and ethos. Or like citing the source, and then you go to the website and it's an actual page, it's an actual source. And then here we have pathos. Pathos is steering emotions and persuasion, works well in gaslighting and arguments or debates. So y'all could be talking about, you and a person could be talking and they'll say, oh, nobody can make me mad. And then you try to prove that you can make them mad. So instead of you know, you sitting there arguing with them, you just rage bait them. And then what that does is that spikes their emotions. And what that plays a part in is steering their emotions. So that's pathos. Or like a commercial with a dog being in a cage and he looks sad. It's gonna make people want to buy the dog because the dog looks sad. If you're a dog person, then you know you'll get where I'm coming from. But that plays a role in emotions. And then for logos is about facts, reason, logic, works well in scientific explanations, statements, conversations, and arguments. Logos is pretty much self-explanatory. Logos is just like logic, like, you know, science, why things are, the reason, you know. And then here we have what is exigence. Exigence is the pure driving force behind writing, almost like it's the reason why. Even with Martin Luther King's speech, the exigence can change depending on the scenario. Key information: the purpose of a text is what the writer hopes to achieve. All right. And we got number 4. Number 4 is just a communication diagram. I have actually 2 of these on, well, I actually have 2 Mbongis that have this similar diagram. I'm going to talk more about that on the Mbongis, but this is just a little communication model, so that way, you know, just, you know, sender, message, channel, receiver. Yeah. And then for number 5, we have communication model. This is pretty much just explaining what I just shown. Key information would be communication has occurred when a message has been sent and received. Basic example would be saying hello or how are you doing to a stranger. I already insinuating the message is in the interaction. Then the stranger processes the message with basically going through the channel. The stranger then says, I'm doing great, thanks for asking. Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver revolutionized communication with the early technology. And then for the key information, it will say model provides an understanding of how information is transferred. Interactive model of communication. In communication at any given time, you can be the sender or receiver. So somebody could walk up the street, say hello, and you have a choice to respond. But if you were to respond, that would pretty much, even if you don't respond and you hear the message, you're pretty much the receiver. Or if you say something to somebody, you're pretty much the sender. And then we have the part in the middle is where the 2 messages overlap, and is where the real meaningful communication actually happens. And then I have one more page, and it is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is just more notes that I took in from those videos that we did. And it says here, Dunning-Kruger effect. So most people with limited competence tend to overestimate their own skills, which could be like people with big egos or people that are very prideful or brag a lot. Most people are like this because they don't see or understand their mistakes and issues. The effect is not a question of ego. People admit that they are wrong to some degree, depending on who they are and the situation. The people that are dealing with the Dunning-Kruger effect should ask others for feedback about their skills and consider it even if they don't like what they're hearing from others. The best way to learn to be better when it comes to making mistakes is learn from them and gain more knowledge on the skill you are trying to master. And then I have a quote here, Dunning-Kruger, 1999. Unskilled and unaware of it, unskilled and unaware of it, how difficulties in recognizing one's incompetence leads to inflated self-assessments. So pretty much people that are very egotistical or prideful, they tend to make more mistakes because they're not necessarily humble. It's like somebody playing basketball and they're really good at basketball, but then they have one bad game. Actually, hold on, wait, that's like another example would be like a mechanic working on a car, and he's worked on 3 or 4 cars, and he thinks he's, you know, really, really good at working on cars. And so he gets tested by other mechanics and he fails because he's only had so much experience, but because he's so egotistical, he messed up. All right, so here we have the first Mbongi, we have the rhetoric and composition Mbongi. And this is pretty much what we've been going over, especially with the first assignment that I've shown with the notes. And here we have the communication model. We have the rhetorical triangle, ethos, focus. We have ethos, logos, and pathos for the rhetorical triangle. And then for ethos, pathos, logos, we have ethic, or ethos, ethics, credibility, trust. And then we have examples of quotes at the bottom. And then we have pathos for passion. And then we have logos for logic, logical reasoning, argument. And we got some examples under there. Okay, so here we have why you must understand why you are taking this course, its relevance to your major. You must understand why this course is relevant outside of academics. I apologize if it's a little blurry. This thing has a hard time focusing, but and then for the Mbongi, we have research all the following: Mbongi communication model, Dunning-Kruger effect, Toni Morrison, and then find and write information on the historic of rhetoric. I've already turned this paper in. And then for the bottom part right here, write a paragraph on why do you think these were the terms assigned to you. Also explain why these items align with the topic. Explain this by dealing on how it relates to your own life. Do not be generic. And it says at the bottom, notes that students bring their written assignments. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be reading that. So let me show you what the paragraph that I have. Okay, so this is the paragraph that I have. And I believe these terms were assigned because they would be related to what we are doing in class. They are also related to a lot of the assignments that we have done, and helps us to get a more deeper understanding of what we are doing. These topics allow us to be better writers and comprehend articles on topics better than these topics. Better. These topics will probably be needed for the future assignment and outside of school. From the way these assignments are, they are very structural, just like my life. Discipline, focus, critical thinking, creative course in life. You'll have to have those things to get through the grit and grind in life. Structure is something a lot of people should have because it can make their lives easier and show more results. That's why these topics are important, because they don't just play a role in the classroom or the major, but in life. They do because they can be used or needed later in life. And that is true. I've learned a lot from this class, and a lot of the stuff that I've been taught, I'm most definitely going to use outside of this English course. And even in my next course, I'm going to be using a lot of these things. So let me go back to the Mbongi real quick. Okay, so here we have the sender, and then we have, this is pretty much like the communication model. This is the first one. And so here we have the sender, the message, the receiver, and some noise at the bottom. And then these are the instructions right here. But it's pretty simple communication model, just basic communication, like, talking or texting. And then I'll move on to the next sheet. And then here we have the rhetorical triangle. It says label each of the three primary rhetorical appeals and define each. So for ethos, I put ethos is a term spoken on credibility and trust of the speaker or author. It also means values and group culture. And at the bottom here, we got logos. Logos is a term that uses logic, facts, evidence, and reasoning. Logos also persuades or influence people through logic, facts, and evidence. And then for pathos, this term uses emotions and feelings to persuade an audience in order to shape the way they think and act. And that is pretty much all for this first Mbongi. I'm gonna move on to the next one. So for this next Mbongi, we have the second one. This one is fairly different. This one has a dog example right here, the communication model at the bottom, and the rhetorical triangle. Right here we have media literacy and social media. And inside we have, you must analyze the media before creating it, and you must be media literate before you can critically analyze media. You must accept the importance of media literacy before becoming a media literate. And then it says here, you are expected to research each term, phrase, and write down your findings. Draw any models. Is written preparations required for class participation. Citations are required. A simple definition does not suffice as research. Consider asking yourself questions about the topic, and then use research to complete the rest of your Mbongi. These terms I did turn in, and then also did some for the other Mbongis too. A lot of the research that I have is also on the other, not other Mbongis, but the research papers of the other Mbongis. I'm sorry. And then it says Neom here. We have present bias, logical fallacy, appeal to pathos as a logical fallacy, attention economy, Dr. Dakota Tyler, Blender software, classical conditioning, and Pavlov's dog, media literacy, anti-intellism, ethos, pathos, logos, chaos, and topos, logical fallacies. And then we have NAMLE, key questions for media literacy. And then we have write a paragraph on why do you think why these terms were assigned to you. Also explain why these items align with the topic. Explain this by detailing how it relates to your own life. Do not be generic. And then it also says APA MLA citations are required. Use intake citation, include reference lists for every assignment. Use a separate sheet of paper if the assignment does not have the designated space for your research or reference list. I apologize for those words. And then let me show you the research paper that I have for the paragraph. And so here for the Mbongi research week 2, we have the research will help with our up and coming assignments and will also assist us with our Mbongi assignment about social media, which also helps with grasping the understanding of our group project. Since it's collaborative, this plays a big role in our lives because it teaches us how to cite evidence before taking in information without researching first. You cannot trust everything you see on the internet or even in person, because what they could be saying could be false, and there is a lot of false information, like a fallacy, out here in the world. A lot of people are being easily influenced by it. The research will truly help develop my skills as far as citing evidence and sources while learning to be knowledgeable on the topic. That way I won't be easily fooled by false information. And I apologize for the shadow. So for here, we're still in the same Mbongi. The second one, right now we have rhetorical appeals. Rhetorical appeals abbreviate. We have abbreviation definition for telos. Appeals to purpose. You may not want to think of telos as related to purpose as it relates to the writer or speaker or debater. And then we have the reflective questions and for the purpose of the author, speaker, or debater. Elaborate on how the opening and concluding statements clearly reveal the purpose and decide if the purpose is supported with detail or elaboration. And then at the bottom, we have ethos, appeals to credibility. You may want to think of ethos as related to ethics or moral principles of the writer. Ethos is the author's way of establishing trust with his or her reader. And then for the reflective question for ethos, we have infer why an individual would decide to read or listen to what the writer has written. Explain how the author cites that he or she has something valid and important for an individual to read or listen to. And then for pathos, we have appeal to emotion. You may want to think of pathos as empathy, which pertains to the experience of sensitivity towards emotion. And then for the reflective question, we have decide how the writer speaker is making the reader / listener respond. And then we have I've emphasized how the reader / speaker is inciting passion. And then for logos, we have appeal to logic. You may want to think of you may want to think of logos as logic because something that is logical makes sense. it is reasonable. Explain how the writer speaker is developing a logical argument. Elaborate on the proof that is given to convince the reader, listener to agree with the writer speaker's position. And then for Carol's, we have Carol's appeals to timeliness. You may want to think timeliness. You may want to think of Carol's as the type of persuasion that pertains to the right place and the right time. Analyze how the writer makes claims that are relevant to what is happening. Decide if the author is making the most of the moment, or attempting to write and speak to the concern of the audience. I'm not gonna lie, these three right here, ethos, pathos, logos, are gonna be, you're gonna see those a lot in the rest of the assignments I'm gonna show you, but ethos, pathos, logos are gonna be very familiar with the rest of my assignments. You don't really typically see telos and carols that much, but it's mostly these three that play a big role in writing and rhetorical appeals. They're just questions to help you recognize and utilize logos, ethos, and pathos. Says here, the following questions can be used in two ways, both to think about how you are using logos, ethos, and pathos in your writing, and also to assess how other writers use them in their writing. Logos is the thesis, clear and specific for the help of thesis statement. Need this thing to focus. And then it says for logos, is the thesis supported by strong reasons and credible evidence? And then it says, is the argument logical and arranged in a well-reasoned order? Ethos is what are the writer's qualifications, how the writer is connected to himself or herself to the topic being discussed. Does the writer demonstrate respect for multiple viewpoints by using the source in the text? Are the sources credible? Are sources documented appropriately? Does the writer use tone that is suitable for the audience purpose? Is the diction, word choice used appropriate for the audience purpose? Is the document presented in a polished and professional manner? And then for pathos, it says, are vivid examples, details, and images used to engage the reader's emotions, imagination? And then at the bottom it says, does the writer appeal to the values and beliefs of the reader by using examples readers can relate to or care about? And then it says, one final thought. While above the questions, can we help you identify or utilize logos, ethos, pathos in writing? It is important to remember that sometimes a particular aspect of a text will represent more than one of these appeals. For example, use credible sources that could be considered both logos and ethos, as the sources help support the logic or reasoning of the text. They'll also help portray the writer as thoughtful and engaged with the topic. This overlap reminds us of how appeals work together and create effective writing for further learning. And then I'm gonna move on to the next page. And like I said before, these three right here are gonna be very familiar because they're gonna always pop up in writing. We have the rhetorical triangle, understanding and using logos, ethos, and pathos. And then we're gonna go right here at the bottom right here. Aristotle taught that a speaker's ability to persuade an audience is based on how well the speaker appeals to the audience in three different areas: logos, ethos, and pathos. Consider together that these appeals form what later rhetoricians have called the rhetorical triangle. Logos appeals to reason. Logos can also be thought as the text of the argument, as well as a writer that has argued his or her point. Ethos appeals to the writer's character. Ethos can also be thought of as the role of the writer in the argument, of how credible his or her argument is. And then pathos appeals to the emotions and the sympathetic imagination, as well as to beliefs and values. Pathos can also be thought of as the role of audience in the argument. Logos ethos, credibility, writer. Logos is reason and text, and pathos is values, benefits, audience. And then here it says rhetorical triangle is typically represented by an equilateral triangle, suggesting that logos and ethos and pathos should be balanced within a text. However, which aspect of the rhetorical triangle you favor in your writing depends on both the audience, purpose, and purpose of that writing. Yet, if you are in doubt, seek a balance among all three elements. And so that's pretty much just giving you a breakdown of what the rhetorical triangle is and what it's about and what's the purpose of it. And then for here we have the communication model. It's pretty much the same thing as the previous communication model, except the difference now is that we have encoding and decoding and feedback. So we know what the sender is, know what the message is. Noise is pretty much just like, noise would be like you send a text out, and if the internet is kind of slow, it can kind of vary depending on how fast the message gets to the person, to the receiver. Or if you're talking to somebody in a crowded area, there's a lot of noise. It kind of depends on how well the quality of how the message sounds talking to that other person, to that receiver. But encoding is pretty much just like, encoding is pretty much like breaking down what the message is, and then decoding is pretty much self-explanatory. It's just like encoding, but it's just you're breaking down what the message is to the receiver. It's kind of like sending out a text message. You know, it has to encode when it's being sent, and then it has to decode when it's being received to the person's phone. And then of course feedback would be like a response, or like when you on your iPhone, somebody send you a message, or you send you a message, and then you read the message, it'll come back and it'll say seen or delivered. So that's pretty much what it is. And then I'm gonna go over the instructions real quick. Label the communication model above. Note, use all the following words in the labeling: sender, receiver, message, noise, feedback, encoding, decoding, and in the lines to the left. Detail how this model is used with social media, as in who is the sender, who is the receiver, and how is the message sent and received. And then it says, note, you may use a specific example that helps. And this is what I use. The sender creates and encodes the message. The message then goes through a channel. Then the receiver decodes and interprets the message, and then proceeds to give feedback, to give a feedback response. And if the conversation keeps going, it goes into the same cycle again. That is communication through social media. Like I said before, it goes through text. And then for the final page, we have ethos and pathos. And then it says here, label each of the three primary rhetorical appeals. What elements or strategies could be included in the communication to address each rhetorical appeal. Make a list of these under each appeal. Only use single words in your list. Phrases with more than 2 words that will not be counted. Note, you may list a specific theory, method that has more than 2 words. And then here we have ethos, respect, credentials, honesty, reputation, character, authenticity, truthfulness, trustworthiness, reliability, citation, ethics. And then for logos, we have simple, engaging, unique, comprehensive, evidence, research, data, explanation, logic, reasoning. And then for pathos, compassion, pride, happiness, sympathy, motivation, anger, faith, passion, fear, and inspiration. And it's pretty much just a much bigger, these are much bigger examples of each of these rhetorical appeals. Because, before the first Mbongi, you had less. You had you write what it is. Now we have more of examples of what these appeals are. So